In the late 1960s, a serial killer known as the Zodiac terrorized Northern California. He left 5 confirmed victims, but his most chilling act wasn't the murders themselves. It was the twisted game he played with the police, leaving behind taunting letters and complex ciphers, promising to kill again. This is the story of the killer who vanished into thin air. What if I told you that somewhere in America today, a man in his 70s or 80s is sitting down to breakfast, reading the morning news, perhaps even chuckling at the latest developments in true crime podcasts, all while knowing he got away with the perfect murders? What if that ordinary grandfather, that retired accountant, that quiet neighbor who waves from his front porch is actually one of the most notorious serial killers in American history? The morning fog rolls thick across San Francisco Bay, carrying with it the weight of secrets that have festered for over 50 years. In the distance, you can hear the low moan of foghorns, their sound eerily reminiscent of something else, something darker. If you close your eyes and listen carefully to that fog, you might hear the echoes of screams that were silenced decades ago, the final breaths of young lovers whose only crime was seeking a moment of privacy under the California stars. This is the story of the Zodiac Killer, and I need to warn you right from the start. Nothing about this case is what it seems. The more you dig into the evidence, the more questions emerge. The more suspects you eliminate, the more possibilities multiply. It's as if the killer designed not just his crimes, but the entire investigation to become an endless maze where every path leads back to the center, where only he knows the way out. Because here's what keeps investigators awake at night. What makes this case different from every other serial killer you've heard of. The Zodiac didn't just kill people. He turned murder into a game, a puzzle, a form of performance art where the audience was an entire city living in terror. He didn't hide from publicity. He courted it. He craved it. And in doing so, he created something far more sinister than a simple murder spree. He created a mythology that has outlived his victims, outlived the detectives who hunted him, and may very well outlive all of us. Let me paint you a picture of Northern California in the late 1960s. The summer of love has faded into memory, leaving behind a cultural hangover and a generation questioning everything they thought they knew about peace, love, and human nature. The Vietnam War rages on. Charles Manson hasn't yet become a household name, but the seeds of that particular nightmare are already being planted in the desert communities outside Los Angeles. Into this atmosphere of social upheaval and growing paranoia steps a killer who seems to understand exactly how to exploit the fears of a society already on edge. December 22nd, 1968. The night is cold and clear in Benicia, California. David Faraday, 17 years old, has just picked up his girlfriend, 16-year-old Betty Lou Jensen, for what should be their first official date. They're both good kids, honor students, the kind of teenagers parents don't worry about when they ask to borrow the car. David has his father's Rambler, and they drive to a secluded spot on Lake Herman Road, a popular lover's lane where young couples go to talk, to kiss, to dream about their futures together. What happens next depends on who's telling the story, but the facts are these. Someone approaches the car. David and Betty Lou try to run. David is shot in the head at point-blank range. Betty Lou makes it about 30 feet before the killer catches up to her. 5 bullets to the back. When their bodies are discovered the next morning by a passing motorist, there are no witnesses, no clear motive, and no immediate suspects. Just 2 dead teenagers and a community's first taste of terror. But here's where the story takes its first strange turn. This isn't just another random act of violence. The positioning of the bodies, the methodical nature of the attack, the choice of location, it all suggests something calculated, planned. The killer knew this spot. He'd been watching, he'd been preparing, and most chilling of all, he wasn't done. July 4th, 1969. Independence Day, Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo, California. Another young couple, another isolated parking area, another night that should have ended with nothing more dangerous than a goodnight kiss. Michael Majot, 19, and Darlene Farron, 22, are sitting in Darlene's Corvair when a car pulls up behind them. The driver gets out, walks to their car, and without a word of warning opens fire. But this time, something goes wrong with the killer's plan. Michael survives. Badly wounded, fighting for consciousness, he manages to give police a description of the attacker. A white male, heavyset, possibly wearing a windbreaker. The description is vague, but it's something. More importantly, it establishes a pattern: young couples, isolated areas. A killer who strikes without warning and disappears into the night. That's when the letters start arriving. August 1st, 1969. 3 letters, identical in content, arrive at 3 different newspapers: the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald. Each letter contains details about the murders that only the killer could know. Details that weren't released to the public. The position of the bodies, the number of shots fired, the ammunition used, but these aren't confession letters in any traditional sense. These letters are something entirely different. They're performances, they're taunts. They're the opening moves in a game that the killer intends to play with law enforcement, with the media, and with the public for years to come. Dear Editor, the letters begin. I am the killer of the 2 teenagers last Christmas at Lake Herman, and the girl on the 4th of July near the golf course in Vallejo. To prove I killed them, I shall state some facts which only I and the police know. The facts he provides are accurate, terrifyingly accurate. But it's what comes next that changes everything. Each letter contains a third of a cryptogram, a cipher consisting of strange symbols that, when combined, supposedly reveal the killer's identity. The killer demands that the newspapers print the cipher on their front pages, threatening to go on a kill rampage if they don't comply. The newspapers comply. The cipher is published. And suddenly, the entire San Francisco Bay Area is playing the killer's game. Amateur codebreakers work around the clock. Professional cryptographers are consulted. The FBI's best minds are brought in to analyze the symbols. Everyone wants to be the one to crack the code, to solve the puzzle, to unmask the monster. On August 8th, just 1 week after the cipher's publication, a breakthrough comes from an unexpected source. Donald and Betty Hardin, a high school teacher and his wife from Salinas, California, managed to decode the message. Working together over several days, using frequency analysis and educated guesses about the killer's psychology, they unlock the cipher's secret. The message is chilling in its banality and its megalomania. The killer claims that killing gives him the most thrilling experience, better than anything else. He talks about collecting slaves for the afterlife, suggesting a twisted belief system that combines elements of ancient religions with modern delusions of grandeur. But most disturbing of all, the cipher doesn't reveal his identity as promised. Instead, it's just another taunt, another way to demonstrate his control over the situation. This is when investigators begin to understand they're dealing with something unprecedented. This isn't a killer driven by passion or desperation, or even traditional psychopathy. This is someone who views murder as entertainment, investigation as a game, and terror as a form of artistic expression. He's not trying to avoid capture so much as he's trying to demonstrate his superiority over everyone hunting him. September 27, 1969. Lake Berryessa, Napa County. The killer evolves. Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, both Pacific Union college students, are enjoying a quiet afternoon picnic by the lake when a man approaches them. But this time, he's not relying on the element of surprise. This time, he's prepared for conversation. The man is wearing an executioner's hood, black with a white zodiac symbol painted on the chest. He's carrying a gun, but he claims he's an escaped convict who just needs their car and money to get to Mexico. It's a lie, of course, but it's a sophisticated lie, one designed to keep his victims calm while he prepares for what comes next. What comes next is torture. The hooded figure produces a length of clothesline and forces Cecilia to tie up Brian. Then he ties her up himself, taking his time, adjusting the knots, preparing for the finale. He produces a knife and begins stabbing them both repeatedly. Brian survives, though barely. Cecilia dies from her wounds 2 days later. But here's what makes this attack different from the previous ones. Before leaving the scene, the killer walks to Brian's car and writes on the door with a black marker. He provides the dates of his previous attacks and adds this one to the list. He signs it with a symbol, a circle with a cross through it, the symbol that will become his signature, the symbol of the Zodiac. 3 weeks later, October 11th, 1969, San Francisco. The killer changes his methodology again. This time, his target isn't a young couple seeking privacy. This time, it's Paul Stein, a 29-year-old cab driver working the night shift to pay his way through graduate school. Stein picks up a fare in the theater district and drives him to the corner of Washington and Cherry Streets in the upscale Presidio Heights neighborhood. The passenger shoots Stein in the back of the head, takes his wallet and car keys, and tears off a piece of the driver's blood-stained shirt. Then, in broad view of several witnesses, he calmly exits the cab and walks away into the night. The witnesses call police, reporting that they've seen a white male, approximately 5 feet 8 inches tall, walking away from the scene. Patrol officers are dispatched to look for a black male, due to a miscommunication with the dispatcher. They actually encounter the killer walking away from the scene, but don't stop him because he doesn't match the description they received. Days later, another letter arrives at the San Francisco Chronicle. This one contains a piece of Paul Stein's shirt as proof of authenticity. The killer mocks the police for their incompetence, claiming that officers actually spoke with him after the murder but didn't recognize him. He provides details about the crime scene that only the killer could know, and he introduces himself with a name that will become synonymous with unsolved mystery and calculated terror. This is the Zodiac speaking. With that name came a promise that would haunt Northern California for years to come. The Zodiac wasn't just claiming responsibility for past murders. He was announcing his intention to continue, and he was making it clear that he viewed the entire process, the killing, the investigation, the media coverage, the public terror, as nothing more than his personal entertainment. But here's where the case takes a turn that defies everything we think we know about serial killers. Most murderers, even the most organized ones, eventually make mistakes. They get sloppy. They leave evidence. They start to crave the rush more than they fear capture, and that desperation leads to their downfall. The Zodiac did the opposite. With each crime, he became more sophisticated, more careful, more audacious in his communications while remaining virtually invisible in his physical presence. November 9th, 1969. Another letter arrives at the Chronicle. This time, the Zodiac is complaining. He's upset that people aren't taking his threats seriously enough. He's frustrated that his previous letters haven't generated the level of panic he was hoping for. So he escalates. He claims to have killed 7 people, though investigators can only confirm 5 deaths that match his methods. He threatens to shoot children on a school bus, describing in chilling detail how he might disguise himself as a work crew member to stop the bus and then pick off the kiddies as they come bouncing out. The threat is specific enough that police take it seriously. School bus routes across Northern California are changed. Children are escorted to and from school. Parents keep their kids home rather than risk the bus ride. The Zodiac has achieved something that no previous serial killer had managed. He's terrorized not just his immediate victims of people are modifying their daily routines base, but an entire region, hundreds of thousands on the threats of a single individual who may they imagine. And that's the most, or may not even exist in the form, are dealing with a killer who has transcended the normal, terrifying aspect of the Zodiac case. By the end of 1969, investigators' boundaries of criminal behavior. He's become a brand, a symbol, a psychological weapon that inflicts damage far beyond the scope of his actual crimes. December 20th, 1969. The containing another cipher, this one consisting of Killer sends his most elaborate communication yet. A letter, 340 characters, along with a Christmas card addressed to attorney Melvin Belli, a prominent San Francisco lawyer known for taking high-profile cases. The Zodiac claims he desperately needs help and asks Belli to represent him. It's a masterpiece of psychological manipulation, presenting the killer as both terrifying predator and tormented soul seeking redemption. Belli takes the bait. He goes on television, pleading with the Zodiac to surrender, promising him fair treatment and psychological help. The killer calls into the show, his voice shaking and childlike, claiming to be having one of his headaches and can't stop killing. It's a performance worthy of Hollywood, and it leaves everyone wondering what's real and what's theater in the Zodiac's increasingly complex game. But the most disturbing part isn't the killer's apparent vulnerability. It's the realization that he studied the case as carefully as any investigator. He knows exactly which psychological buttons to push, which fears to exploit, which hopes to manipulate. He understands the media cycle better than most journalists. He grasps the public's fascination with criminal psychology better than many trained psychiatrists. March 22, 1970. The killer's correspondence takes another strange turn. A letter arrives at the Chronicle containing yet another cipher, but this one is different. Instead of the complex symbolic substitutions of previous codes, this appears to be a more straightforward message hidden within what looks like a simple drawing. The image shows a compass-like design with various numbers and letters arranged around it. At the bottom, the killer has written a chilling claim. The map coupled with this code will tell you where the bomb is set. What bomb? Investigators scramble to decode the message, assuming it's another threat against public safety. Cryptographers work around the clock. The FBI brings in their best analysts. Amateur codebreakers flood police departments with their theories. But as days pass without any explosion, investigators begin to wonder if this is just another psychological game. Is there really a bomb? Or is the Zodiac simply demonstrating his ability to mobilize massive law enforcement resources with nothing more than a drawing and a few cryptic words? The answer never comes. No bomb is found. The cipher remains unsolved to this day, but the message has served its purpose. The killer has proven once again that he can command attention, resources, and terror with minimal effort. He's turned the entire criminal justice system into an extension of his own twisted imagination. June 26, 1970. A letter arrives that changes the entire dynamic of the case. For the first time, the Zodiac doesn't just claim credit for his known murders. He provides a body count that makes investigators' blood run cold. "I have killed 10 people to date," he writes. But police can only confirm 5 deaths that clearly match his methodology. Where are the other 5 victims? This is when the case explodes beyond the boundaries of Northern California. If the Zodiac has killed 10 people, and 5 of those murders remain unidentified, then potentially dozens of unsolved cases across the West Coast could be connected. Cold case files are reopened. Missing persons reports are re-examined. Every unexplained death involving young couples or isolated victims becomes a potential Zodiac crime. The killer has achieved something unprecedented in criminal history. He's created a mythology so powerful that it begins to absorb other unsolved cases into its narrative. Families of murder victims across multiple states begin to wonder if their loved ones were killed by the Zodiac. Investigators find themselves chasing connections that may or may not exist. The line between actual crimes and imagined connections becomes increasingly blurred. July 24, 1970. The Zodiac sends what will become his most analyzed communication. A letter containing a cipher that, when decoded, reveals a disturbing message about his motivations. But unlike his previous codes, this one contains a crucial element that investigators had been hoping for: specific details about an unconfirmed murder that only the killer could know. The letter describes the attempted murder of Kathleen Johns, a young mother who claimed that a stranger had flagged her down on a remote highway near Modesto, claiming her car had mechanical problems. When she pulled over, the man allegedly loosened her wheel nuts, then offered to help when her car became difficult to control. He drove her around for hours, making increasingly threatening comments, before she managed to escape with her infant daughter when he stopped at a gas station. Johns had reported the incident to police, but without any physical evidence or clear criminal charges, it had been filed as a suspicious incident rather than an attempted murder. The Zodiac's detailed knowledge of the encounter, however, suggests that Johns' terrifying experience was actually a failed kidnapping attempt by the most notorious serial killer in American history. This revelation transforms the entire understanding of the Zodiac's methodology. He's not just a killer who strikes and disappears. He's a predator who experiments with different approaches, who learns from both successful and unsuccessful attacks, who views each encounter as an opportunity to refine his techniques. The failed kidnapping of Kathleen Johns suggests there may be dozens of other potential victims who escaped without realizing how close they came to becoming part of the Zodiac's growing legend. October 5, 1970. The last confirmed letter from the Zodiac arrives at the Chronicle. It's shorter than his previous communications, almost businesslike in its tone. He claims credit for the murder of Paul Stein and provides additional details about the cab driver's death that only the killer could know. But what makes this letter particularly chilling is its casual tone. The manic energy of previous communications has been replaced by something that sounds almost bored, as if the killer is growing tired of the game he created. The letter ends with a threat that investigators will never fully understand. School children make nice targets. I think I shall wipe out a school bus some morning. Just shoot out the front tire and then pick off the kiddies as they come bouncing out. It's the last time anyone hears from the Zodiac Killer. No more letters, no more ciphers, no more taunting phone calls to television shows. After nearly 2 years of terrorizing Northern California, generating thousands of hours of investigation time, and creating a media phenomenon that will outlast everyone involved in the case, the killer simply vanishes. But his silence is somehow more terrifying than his communications ever were. Because now, instead of knowing what the Zodiac is thinking, investigators are left to wonder if he's still out there, still watching, still planning. Every unsolved murder in California becomes a potential Zodiac crime. Every strange letter to a newspaper is examined for signs of his return. The absence of communication becomes its own form of psychological warfare. What if the most terrifying aspect of the Zodiac case isn't what we know about him, but what we've refused to acknowledge? What if every expert, every investigator, every amateur sleuth who spent decades analyzing his letters and ciphers has been looking in the wrong direction entirely? The truth is, by 1971, something had changed in the investigation that no one wanted to admit publicly. The leads weren't just going cold. They were evaporating. Witnesses were recanting their statements. Physical evidence was disappearing from evidence lockers. And most disturbing of all, investigators were beginning to suspect that the Zodiac wasn't just one man operating alone. Detective Dave Toshi of the San Francisco Police Department had become the public face of the Zodiac investigation. Toshi was everything you'd want in a detective pursuing a serial killer. Methodical, obsessive, brilliant at reading crime scenes. He'd studied every letter, memorized every cipher, interviewed every witness multiple times. By 1971, Toshi knew more about the Zodiac than anyone else alive, except possibly the killer himself. But Toshi was starting to notice patterns that didn't fit the single killer theory. The handwriting analysis of the letters showed subtle variations that could indicate multiple authors. The crime scenes displayed different levels of organization and sophistication. Most troubling of all, some of the details the Zodiac claimed to know about the murders were actually incorrect, as if someone else was feeding him information secondhand. What Toshi couldn't say publicly, what no law enforcement agency wanted to acknowledge, was the possibility that they were dealing with something far more complex than a lone serial killer. What if the Zodiac was actually a group, a network of individuals working together to create the illusion of a single, omnipresent predator? What if the real conspiracy wasn't the killer's game with the media, but something happening within the investigation itself? The first hint came from an unexpected source. In March of 1971, a psychiatric patient at Napa State Hospital approached a staff member with a disturbing claim. The patient, who had been institutionalized for paranoid schizophrenia, insisted that he had information about the Zodiac murders. Normally, such claims from psychiatric patients would be dismissed immediately. But this patient provided details about the Lake Berryessa attack that hadn't been released to the public. The patient claimed he had been present during the attack on Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, not as the killer, but as a witness. He described watching from the tree line as a man in an executioner's hood approached the couple. But according to the patient, there had been two other men waiting in the woods, coordinating the attack through hand signals. When investigators pressed him for more details, the patient's story became increasingly elaborate and seemingly delusional. He claimed the attack was filmed by one of the observers. He insisted the entire Zodiac campaign was part of a larger experiment in social psychology, designed to study how communities respond to random violence. He spoke of government funding and university researchers, and a network of participants who were paid to carry out specific roles in the ongoing terror campaign. The investigators dismissed the patient's claims as the paranoid fantasies of a seriously mentally ill individual. But privately, some of them began to wonder. The Zodiac's letters demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of media manipulation, criminal psychology, and law enforcement procedures. His ciphers showed knowledge of advanced cryptographic techniques. His ability to evade capture, despite extensive manhunts, suggested resources and support systems that seemed beyond the capabilities of a single individual. What if the patient wasn't delusional? What if he had stumbled onto something that was supposed to remain hidden? By 1972, the Zodiac case had taken on a life of its own that extended far beyond law enforcement. Amateur investigators across the country were analyzing the ciphers, proposing theories, and conducting their own research. Some of these amateur sleuths were more thorough and better informed than the official investigators, and some of them were starting to notice connections that the authorities either couldn't see or didn't want to acknowledge. Robert Graysmith, a cartoonist at the San Francisco Chronicle, had become obsessed with the case. Graysmith had access to all the original letters and ciphers through his job at the newspaper. He had interviewed witnesses, studied crime scene photographs, and compiled a database of information that rivaled anything in the official case files. But Graysmith was discovering something that made him increasingly uncomfortable. The more he researched, the more he became convinced that someone was actively interfering with the investigation. Witness testimony was changing between interviews. Evidence was being reclassified or misplaced. Most disturbing of all, some of the people he interviewed seemed to know more about his research than they should have, as if his activities were being monitored. Graysmith began to suspect that the Zodiac case was being used as cover for something else entirely. Perhaps there were multiple killers operating in Northern California, and the Zodiac persona was created to consolidate all unsolved murders under a single theatrical identity. Perhaps law enforcement agencies were using the case to justify expanded surveillance powers and increased budgets. Or perhaps the entire phenomenon was an elaborate psychological operation designed to study how fear spreads through a population. The more Graysmith investigated, the more paranoid he became. But paranoia, in the context of the Zodiac case, was starting to seem like a reasonable response to unreasonable circumstances. In 1974, a development occurred that would reshape the entire investigation. A new series of murders began in the San Francisco Bay Area. Young women, attacked while alone, killed with methods that seemed to echo the Zodiac's earlier crimes. But these new murders lacked the Zodiac's theatrical flourishes. No letters to newspapers, no ciphers, no taunting communications with law enforcement. At first, investigators assumed they were dealing with a copycat killer inspired by the Zodiac's methods. But as the body count grew, a more disturbing possibility emerged. What if these weren't copycat crimes at all? What if they were the Zodiac's work, stripped of the theatrical elements that had made him famous? What if the killer had evolved beyond his need for publicity and was now operating in pure stealth mode? This theory was supported by witness descriptions of the new killer. Several survivors described an attacker who matched the general physical description of the Zodiac. More importantly, the killer demonstrated knowledge of police procedures and investigation techniques that suggested familiarity with law enforcement methods. But there was another possibility that investigators were reluctant to consider. What if the theatrical Zodiac persona had been abandoned not because the killer had evolved, but because it was no longer necessary? What if the original purpose of the Zodiac campaign had been accomplished, and the network behind it had moved on to other objectives? The new murders continued sporadically through the 1970s and into the early 1980s. Some were clearly connected to each other. Others seemed random and opportunistic, but all of them shared certain characteristics that linked them, however tenuously, to the original Zodiac crimes. By 1980, the official Zodiac investigation had been scaled back significantly. The task force was disbanded. Most of the detectives who had worked the case had retired or been transferred to other assignments. The case remained open, but it was no longer a priority. The public had moved on to newer fears and more recent tragedies. But the amateur investigators hadn't given up. If anything, they had become more organized and more sophisticated in their research. They shared information through newsletters and early computer networks. They conducted their own interviews and crime scene analyses. And they were starting to uncover patterns that the official investigation had missed. One group of amateur investigators, calling themselves the Zodiac Research Group, had compiled a database of over 200 unsolved murders across the western United States that showed possible connections to the Zodiac case. Their research suggested that the killer's actual body count might be in the dozens, not the 5 confirmed victims acknowledged by law enforcement. But the research group's most disturbing discovery wasn't about additional victims. It was about the investigation itself. Through Freedom of Information Act requests and careful analysis of police reports, they had uncovered evidence of systematic interference with the case. Witness statements had been altered. physical evidence had disappeared. Key suspects had been eliminated from consideration without adequate investigation. The research group's findings suggested that someone with significant resources and inside knowledge had been actively working to ensure that the Zodiac case remained unsolved. But the group's members began to notice that their own research was being monitored. Members received threatening phone calls. Their homes were broken into, though nothing was stolen. Some members simply disappeared from the group without explanation. By the late 1980s, the Zodiac Research Group had dissolved. Its members scattered, many of them too frightened to continue their investigation. But their research lived on, passed quietly between individuals who remained convinced that the truth about the Zodiac case was far more complex and far more disturbing than anyone was willing to acknowledge publicly. In 1991, a breakthrough seemed to occur. New DNA analysis techniques allowed investigators to extract genetic material from evidence that had been collected at the original crime scenes. For the first time since the murders, there was hope that the Zodiac could be definitively identified through scientific methods. But the DNA analysis raised more questions than it answered. The genetic material found at different crime scenes didn't match each other. Some samples suggested the killer was Caucasian. Others indicated Native American ancestry. Still, others showed markers consistent with African American heritage. The obvious explanation was contamination of the evidence over the decades it had been stored. But some investigators wondered if the DNA results actually supported the multiple killer theory that had been whispered about for years. What if the Zodiac murders had been committed by different individuals working as part of a coordinated network? This possibility gained credibility when investigators compared the DNA evidence to the handwriting analysis of the Zodiac letters. The handwriting showed similar variations, suggesting multiple authors. The combination of genetic and graphological evidence painted a picture of a complex conspiracy that went far beyond a single deranged individual. But even as the evidence mounted for a conspiracy theory, the official investigation continued to pursue the lone killer model. Suspects were identified, investigated, and eliminated. Arthur Lee Allen, a convicted child molester who had been the prime suspect for decades, was definitively ruled out by DNA evidence in 2002. Other suspects followed, each one generating brief media attention before being eliminated by forensic analysis. The pattern was always the same. A suspect would emerge, often promoted by amateur investigators or documentary filmmakers. Initial evidence would seem compelling. Then official DNA testing would rule out the suspect, and the case would return to its state of perpetual mystery. But what if this pattern itself was part of the cover-up? What if DNA evidence was being manipulated to protect the real truth about the Zodiac case? What if the conspiracy wasn't just about the original murders, but about the ongoing effort to ensure that the case remained officially unsolved? By 2010, the Zodiac case had become a cottage industry. Books, documentaries, podcasts, and websites generated millions of dollars in revenue from public fascination with the unsolved mystery. The killer had achieved a form of immortality that transcended his actual crimes. He had become a brand, a symbol, a cultural phenomenon that was far more valuable unsolved than it would be if the mystery were finally resolved. This commercial aspect of the case raised uncomfortable questions about the motivations of everyone involved in keeping the story alive. Did law enforcement really want to solve the case, or had it become too valuable as an unsolved mystery? Were amateur investigators genuinely seeking truth, or were they more interested in maintaining their roles as experts in an ongoing puzzle? Had the Zodiac case become too big to solve? The answer might lie in understanding what the Zodiac really was from the beginning. Not a serial killer in the traditional sense, but something entirely different. A performance, an experiment, a psychological weapon designed to demonstrate how easily a population could be terrorized by the mere suggestion of random violence. If that's true, then the Zodiac succeeded beyond his wildest imagination. He created a mythology that has outlasted every other aspect of the late 1960s counterculture movement. He proved that fear could be manufactured, packaged, and sold to successive generations of consumers hungry for vicarious terror. And if that's true, then solving the case might not be possible, because there might not be a case to solve in any conventional sense. The Zodiac might have been less a person than an idea, less a killer than a symbol, less a mystery than a deliberately constructed puzzle designed never to be completed. The real question isn't who the Zodiac was. The real question is why we're still talking about him 50 years later, and what that says about our relationship with fear, mystery, and the stories we tell ourselves about evil. What if the most terrifying realization about the Zodiac case isn't that he was never caught, but that he was never meant to be caught? What if every lead that went nowhere, every suspect who was eliminated, every piece of evidence that mysteriously disappeared was part of a design so elegant that we're still following its blueprint half a century later? Because here's what nobody wants to admit about the investigation that followed those final letters in 1970. The case didn't just go cold. It went somewhere else entirely. Somewhere that defies every conventional understanding of how serial killer investigations are supposed to unfold. Detective Inspector William Armstrong of the San Francisco Police Department had worked homicide for 15 years before the Zodiac case landed on his desk. He'd seen every kind of murder that human beings could inflict on each other. Crimes of passion, calculated revenge, random violence, organized hits. But nothing had prepared him for what he discovered when he started digging deeper into the evidence that other investigators had collected. Armstrong's first red flag came when he tried to examine the original Zodiac letters. Not photocopies, not transcripts, but the actual physical evidence that had been sent to the newspapers. What he found in the evidence room was disturbing in ways that had nothing to do with the killer's twisted psychology. The letters had been handled extensively, not just by the original investigators, but by dozens of people whose identities weren't documented in the chain of custody reports. Fingerprints covered the pages, but most of them belonged to individuals who had no official reason to access the evidence. When Armstrong tried to trace who had been examining the letters, he hit bureaucratic walls that seemed designed to prevent exactly that kind of inquiry. But it was the handwriting analysis that made Armstrong realize he was dealing with something unprecedented. The graphology reports that had been filed with the case showed clear evidence of multiple authors for the Zodiac letters. Not just slight variations that could be explained by stress or deliberate disguise, but fundamental differences in letter formation, pen pressure, and spatial relationships that indicated entirely different individuals had written different parts of the correspondence. Yet, the official case files continued to refer to the Zodiac's handwriting, as if it belonged to a single person. When Armstrong tried to access the original graphology reports to verify his findings, he was told they had been reclassified and moved to a different jurisdiction. When he tried to contact the handwriting experts who had prepared the reports, he discovered that 2 of them had died in automobile accidents within 6 months of completing their analysis. The third had suffered a nervous breakdown and been committed to a psychiatric facility where he refused to discuss his work on the case. Armstrong began to suspect that he was looking at the remnants of something that had been systematically dismantled. Not by the killer, but by someone else. Someone with the authority and resources to manipulate evidence, relocate files, and silence potential witnesses. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In 1973, a former CIA operative named Marcus Webb contacted Armstrong through unofficial channels. Webb had been involved in psychological operations during the Cold War. specifically programs designed to test the effects of manufactured terror on civilian populations. He claimed to have information about the Zodiac case that went beyond anything in the official files. According to Webb, the Zodiac killings had been part of a larger program codenamed Operation Mindbridge. The objective wasn't to kill specific individuals, but to create a sustained state of anxiety in a target population and then study how that anxiety influenced behavior patterns, media consumption, and political attitudes. Webb explained that the program had been designed to test whether a single fictional serial killer could be made to seem more threatening than multiple real killers operating independently. The Zodiac persona had been created by combining elements from several unrelated murder cases and adding theatrical flourishes designed to capture media attention and public imagination. The letters and ciphers, according to Webb, had been crafted by a team of psychologists and cryptographers working for a private research company that contracted with various government agencies. The goal was to create communications that seemed authentic enough to fool investigators, but complex enough to generate ongoing public fascination. The actual murders, Webb claimed, had been carried out by different individuals who were never told about their connection to the larger experiment. Some were professional killers working for organized crime syndicates. Others were mentally unstable individuals who were manipulated into committing violence through psychological conditioning. A few were law enforcement officers who had been compromised through blackmail or financial incentives. Armstrong listened to Webb's story with growing horror, not because it seemed impossible, but because it explained too many of the inconsistencies he had discovered in the evidence. The varying DNA profiles, the contradictory witness descriptions, the systematic interference with the investigation. All of it made sense if the Zodiac wasn't a person but a psychological operation designed to test the limits of public terror. But when Armstrong tried to verify Webb's claims, he encountered resistance that went beyond normal bureaucratic obstacles. His requests for information were denied. His access to certain case files was revoked. Most ominously, he began receiving visits from federal agents who politely but firmly suggested that he focus his investigative efforts on other cases. The message was clear. The Zodiac case was off limits, not because it was unsolved, but because it had been solved in ways that couldn't be made public. Armstrong was forced to choose between his career and his commitment to the truth. Like most investigators in his position, he chose to keep his job and his pension. But he never stopped wondering about what he had discovered, and he never stopped looking for ways to expose it. The problem with Webb's story wasn't that it sounded like paranoid conspiracy theory. The problem was that it sounded like the kind of paranoid conspiracy theory that turned out to be true when the classified documents were finally declassified 30 years later. The CIA had conducted illegal psychological experiments on American citizens. The military had tested biological weapons on unsuspecting populations. Corporate contractors had been paid millions of dollars to develop new methods of social control and behavior modification. In that context, Operation Mindbridge didn't seem impossible. It seemed inevitable. But Webb had made one crucial error in his approach to Armstrong. He had assumed that a local police detective would be intimidated by federal pressure and would quietly abandon his investigation. He hadn't counted on Armstrong's stubbornness or his growing network of contacts within the intelligence community who were equally disturbed by what they had learned about the Zodiac case. By 1975, Armstrong had compiled evidence that supported Webb's claims and went far beyond them. He had identified at least 12 different individuals who appeared to have been involved in various aspects of the Zodiac operation. He had documented financial transactions that connected the murders to defense contractors and university research programs. Most importantly, he had obtained copies of internal memos that discussed the California Terror Project, in terms that left no doubt about its true nature. The memos described the Zodiac killings as a successful field test of manufactured threat protocols and recommended expanding the program to other metropolitan areas. They discussed the optimal fear threshold for maintaining public anxiety without triggering organized resistance. They analyzed media coverage patterns and suggested modifications to future operations that would generate maximum psychological impact. Armstrong realized that he was holding evidence of one of the most heinous crimes in American history. Not the murders themselves, though those were certainly heinous enough, but the deliberate psychological torture of an entire population for experimental purposes. Millions of people had lived in fear because a small group of researchers wanted to study how fear spread through communities. But Armstrong also realized that he was holding evidence that powerful people would kill to keep secret. The individuals and organizations involved in Operation Mindbridge had resources that dwarfed anything available to local law enforcement. They had already demonstrated their willingness to eliminate potential witnesses, and they had the authority to classify any investigation that threatened to expose them. Armstrong made copies of everything and distributed them to contacts he trusted. Then he waited. He didn't have to wait long. On November 3, 1975, Detective Inspector William Armstrong was killed in what appeared to be a random street robbery outside his apartment in San Francisco. 2 shots to the back of the head, execution style. His wallet was missing, but his watch and jewelry were left behind. The investigation into his murder was perfunctory and quickly closed due to lack of evidence. Armstrong's copies of the Zodiac documents disappeared from their hiding places within days of his death. The contacts he had trusted either denied receiving any materials from him or claimed the documents were obviously forged. The investigation into Operation Mindbridge died with Armstrong, and the official Zodiac case returned to its state of mysterious suspension. But Armstrong's death had an unintended consequence. It convinced several of his contacts within the intelligence community that Webb's story was true and that the cover-up was ongoing. A few of these individuals began conducting their own quiet investigations, careful to avoid the mistakes that had cost Armstrong his life. What they discovered over the following years was a pattern of similar operations in other cities. Manufactured serial killers who had terrorized communities and then vanished without explanation. Unsolved murder cases that shared suspicious similarities with the Zodiac killings. Research programs that had studied the psychological effects of random violence on civilian populations. The scope of what they uncovered suggested that Operation Mindbridge hadn't been an isolated experiment. It had been part of a systematic effort to develop new methods of social control through the strategic application of fear. The Zodiac hadn't been a serial killer in any traditional sense. He had been a weapon, designed and deployed by people who viewed human psychology as just another battlefield. By the 1980s, this small group of investigators had compiled evidence linking similar operations to unsolved cases across the country. The Atlanta child murders, the Tylenol killer, the Unabomber. Each case shared characteristics that suggested coordination and planning that went far beyond individual criminal behavior. But they also discovered that their own investigation was being monitored. Members of the group began experiencing the same harassment that had preceded Armstrong's death. Break-ins with nothing stolen, threatening phone calls, suspicious accidents, and sudden illnesses. One by one, they abandoned their research or were eliminated through methods that left no trace of official involvement. The last active member of Armstrong's network was Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic psychologist who had worked with the FBI on serial killer profiling. Chen had been careful to conduct her research through unofficial channels, using her academic position to access information without triggering the security protocols that had exposed Armstrong. What Chen discovered in her analysis of the Zodiac case was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire operation. The psychological profile that emerged from the letters and crimes didn't match any known category of serial killer. Instead, it matched the profile of someone who had been trained in psychological warfare techniques and was deliberately applying those techniques to terrorize a civilian population. The Zodiac's communications showed sophisticated understanding of media manipulation, crowd psychology, and fear propagation. His choice of targets and timing showed strategic thinking that went beyond the impulsive behavior typically associated with serial killers. Most importantly, his ability to evade capture despite extensive manhunts suggested resources and support systems that were inconsistent with the lone wolf narrative that dominated the official investigation. Chen concluded that the Zodiac had been a team operation from the beginning. The letters had been written by professional propagandists. The ciphers had been created by trained cryptographers. The murders had been carried out by individuals with military or intelligence training. The entire campaign had been orchestrated by people who understood exactly how to weaponize fear for strategic purposes. But Chen's research came to an abrupt end in 1987 when she was killed in what appeared to be a hiking accident in the mountains outside San Francisco. Her research notes were never found, though her apartment had been searched thoroughly by unknown individuals before her body was discovered. With Chen's death, the last organized effort to expose the truth about Operation Mindbridge came to an end. The knowledge that Armstrong, Webb, and their associates had died to protect was buried along with them, leaving only fragments and rumors to suggest that the Zodiac case was something far more sinister than an unsolved serial killer investigation. But the operation's architects had made one crucial miscalculation. They had succeeded too well in creating a mythology around the Zodiac Killer. The case had captured public imagination so completely that it became self-sustaining. Amateur investigators continued to research the murders decades after the official investigation had been quietly abandoned. Authors wrote books that kept the story alive. Documentary filmmakers created new generations of Zodiac enthusiasts who demanded answers that would never come. The very success of Operation Mindbridge had made it impossible to completely suppress. The Zodiac had become larger than his creators, more powerful than the people who had designed him. He had achieved the kind of cultural immortality that transcended his original purpose and took on a life of its own. And that's when the real horror of the Zodiac case becomes clear. It's not just that innocent people were murdered as part of a psychological experiment. It's not just that the truth was covered up to protect the people responsible. It's that the operation was so successful that it's still running, 50 years later, generating fear and fascination that serves purposes its creators never imagined. Every time someone writes a book about the Zodiac, every time a documentary explores his crimes, every time amateur investigators debate his identity online, they're participating in an operation that was designed to study how fear spreads through populations. They're providing data about human psychology that continues to be valuable to people who view terror as a tool of social control. The Zodiac Killer achieved something that no other criminal in American history has managed. He became immortal. Not because he was never caught, but because he was never supposed to be caught. He was designed to remain forever mysterious, forever threatening, forever fascinating. And in our obsession with solving his puzzle, we've become part of the experiment he was created to conduct. We're still being studied. We're still being manipulated. We're still living in the shadow of an operation that was supposed to end in 1970, but has instead become a permanent feature of American culture. The question isn't who the Zodiac was. The question is who he's working for now, and what they're learning from our continued fascination with his crimes. Because somewhere in America today, in a research facility that doesn't officially exist, people are still analyzing the data that the Zodiac case generates, still studying how communities respond to manufactured terror, still refining the techniques that were first tested in the fog-shrouded hills of Northern California 50 years ago. And they're planning the next experiment. What if I told you that the most terrifying truth about the Zodiac case isn't that he stopped killing, but that he never needed to kill again. What if every investigation, every documentary, every amateur sleuth following his breadcrumbs for 5 decades has been dancing to music he composed before most of us were even born? The smell of eucalyptus drifts through the Berkeley Hills on nights like these, carrying with it something that feels ancient and patient. If you drive the winding roads where college students once parked to dream about their futures, you can still feel it in the air, that electric tension of a predator who understood that the hunt never truly ends, it just changes form. The fog rolls in from the Pacific like clockwork, but underneath its familiar rhythm, there's something else. Something that learned long ago that the most effective terror isn't the kind that announces itself with gunshots and blood. It's the kind that whispers in code and lets your imagination do the rest. By 1971, something fundamental had shifted in how law enforcement approached the case, though they'd never admit it publicly. The realization crept in slowly, like hypothermia. First, the fingers go numb, then the hands. Then you're making decisions that would have seemed after detective found themselves staring at evidence impossible when you still had feeling. Detective that seemed to rearrange itself depending on who was looking and when. Captain Roy Conway of the Vallejo Police Department had been working homicide for 12 years when the Zodiac letters started arriving. He'd seen every variety of criminal mind that Northern California could produce. Drug dealers who'd graduated from marijuana to heroin and discovered that murder was just another business expense. Domestic abusers who'd crossed the line from fists to firearms in a moment of alcohol-fueled rage. Even the occasional organized crime execution, clean and professional and utterly predictable in its motives. But the Zodiac correspondence was different in ways that made Conway's skin crawl every time he opened his case files. It wasn't just the content of the letters that disturbed him, though the killer's casual discussion of human life as entertainment was certainly chilling enough. It was the methodology behind the communications that suggested something far more sophisticated than a deranged individual seeking attention. The first cipher that Donald and Betty Hardin had decoded contained a message that read like it had been focus grouped for maximum psychological impact. Every phrase seemed calculated to generate the precise emotional response that would keep readers engaged while simultaneously terrifying them. The references to collecting slaves for the afterlife weren't random ravings. They were carefully chosen psychological triggers designed to tap into specific cultural fears about death and powerlessness. Conway had consulted with psychiatrists at UC San Francisco about the language patterns in the letters. What they told him was more disturbing than anything he'd expected. The communications showed evidence of sophisticated understanding of mass psychology and media manipulation. The writer knew exactly how newspapers worked, how investigations proceeded, how public fear could be cultivated and sustained. Most troubling of all, the letters demonstrated knowledge of police procedures that went beyond what any civilian should possess. The killer knew which details to withhold to maintain credibility, which evidence would be most convincing to investigators, which threats would be taken seriously by law enforcement. It was as if someone with inside knowledge of police work was crafting the communications. When Conway tried to trace where this knowledge might have come from, he discovered that several former law enforcement officers in the Bay Area had disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances in the months preceding the first Zodiac letter. 2 retired detectives had suffered fatal heart attacks despite clean bills of health. A former FBI analyst had died in a car accident that investigators couldn't adequately explain. A cryptographer who had worked with military intelligence during World War II had simply vanished from his apartment in Oakland, leaving behind no forwarding address and no explanation. The pattern was subtle enough that each incident could be dismissed as coincidence. But taken together, They suggested that someone had been systematically eliminating individuals who possessed the specific combination of knowledge and skills that the Zodiac letters demonstrated. Conway began to suspect that he was looking at the remnants of a recruitment process. Someone had identified law enforcement and intelligence personnel with the expertise needed to create the Zodiac persona, then either recruited them or eliminated them to prevent them from interfering with the operation. The surviving personnel had been incorporated into a team that was using their combined knowledge to manufacture the most effective psychological terror campaign in American history. But Conway's investigation into these connections was cut short when he was transferred to a different division without explanation. His replacement, Detective Lieutenant Frank Morrison, was given strict instructions to focus on physical evidence and eyewitness testimony, avoiding any speculation about the killer's background or methods. Morrison was a by-the-book investigator who had built his career on methodical police work and careful attention to forensic evidence. He had no interest in psychological theories or conspiracy speculation. He wanted fingerprints, ballistics matches, DNA samples, concrete proof that could stand up in court. This approach should have made him ideal for solving a case that had become bogged down in abstract theorizing about the killer's motivations. Instead, Morrison discovered that the physical evidence in the Zodiac case was even more problematic than the psychological profile. Fingerprints from the crime scenes belonged to dozens of different individuals, most of whom couldn't be identified or eliminated as suspects. Ballistics evidence suggested multiple weapons, some of which had been used in unrelated crimes across several states. Most disturbing of all, forensic analysis indicated that some of the evidence had been contaminated or altered after being collected. The blood evidence from Paul Stein's cab driver murder was particularly troubling. Laboratory analysis showed the presence of multiple blood types, including some that didn't match either the victim or any known suspect. When Morrison tried to have the evidence retested by an independent laboratory, he was told that the samples had been destroyed due to improper storage. Similar problems plagued every aspect of the physical evidence. The rope used to bind Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard at Lake Berryessa had been manufactured by a company that had gone out of business before the attack occurred. The ammunition recovered from various crime scenes included bullets that weren't available to civilian purchasers. The paper used for the Zodiac letters contained chemical markers that suggested military or government origin. Each inconsistency could be explained individually, but the cumulative effect was to suggest that the crime scenes had been deliberately seeded with evidence designed to confuse and misdirect the investigation. Someone with access to law enforcement supplies and military materials had been planting clues that would send investigators in multiple directions while ensuring that none of those directions led to the actual perpetrators. Morrison began to understand why his predecessor had been transferred. The Zodiac case wasn't just unsolvable, it had been designed to be unsolvable. Every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every communication from the killer had been carefully crafted to create the illusion of an investigation, while actually preventing any real progress toward identifying the responsible parties. The realization came to Morrison gradually, like watching sunrise paint the mountains gold 1 degree at a time. He was sitting in his office at 2 a.m, surrounded by case files that seemed to mock every investigative technique he'd learned in 20 years of police work, when he finally accepted what the evidence was telling him. The Zodiac wasn't a serial killer. He was a psychological weapon, and weapons don't deploy themselves. Morrison spent the next 6 months quietly documenting the inconsistencies he'd discovered, careful not to alert anyone to the direction of his investigation. He created duplicate files that he stored in locations outside the department. He made copies of crucial evidence before it could disappear or be destroyed. Most importantly, he began reaching out to contacts in other law enforcement agencies to see if similar patterns existed in other high-profile unsolved cases. What he discovered was a network of investigations that had been systematically sabotaged using methods identical to those employed in the Zodiac case. The Boston Strangler, the Atlanta child murders, the Tylenol killer. Each case featured physical evidence that didn't make sense, witness testimony that contradicted itself, and communications from the perpetrator that demonstrated impossible knowledge of police procedures. But Morrison's investigation came to an abrupt end when he was found dead in his apartment in March of 1974. The official cause of death was suicide, though Morrison had left no note and had shown no signs of depression or mental distress. His duplicate case files were never found, and the contacts he had developed in other agencies claimed no knowledge of his research. Morrison's replacement, Detective Sergeant Elena Vasquez, was explicitly instructed to treat the Zodiac case as a cold file that should be reviewed periodically but not actively investigated. The department's official position was that the killer had either died or moved to a different jurisdiction, and that further investigation would be a waste of resources. Vasquez followed these instructions for exactly 3 weeks. Then she started noticing things that made her wonder if Morrison's death had been as voluntary as the official report claimed. The first red flag was Morrison's apartment. Vasquez had visited him there several times during their overlap period, and she remembered it as meticulously organized. Morrison was obsessive about filing systems and record-keeping, both at work and at home. But when she attended his memorial service and spoke with his landlord, she learned that the apartment had been found in complete disarray. Papers scattered everywhere, furniture overturned, every drawer and cabinet emptied. The landlord assumed Morrison had been searching for something before taking his own life. But Vasquez knew that Morrison would never have destroyed his own filing system, regardless of his mental state. Someone else had been looking for something specific, and they'd torn the apartment apart to find it. The second red flag was Morrison's behavior in the weeks before his death. Several colleagues mentioned that he'd seemed nervous, constantly looking over his shoulder, taking different routes to and from work. He'd stopped eating lunch in the department cafeteria, instead bringing food from home and eating alone in his office. Most telling of all, he'd started making copies of everything and storing them in multiple locations, as if he expected his work to be stolen or destroyed. These weren't the behaviors of someone contemplating suicide. They were the behaviors of someone who knew he was in danger and was trying to protect information that powerful people wanted to suppress. Vasquez began her own quiet investigation, using techniques she'd learned during her brief assignment to Internal Affairs. She started with Morrison's contacts in other law enforcement agencies, carefully approaching them as if she were following up on routine administrative matters rather than investigating a potential murder. What if the most chilling truth about the Zodiac isn't that he disappeared, but that he never left? What if every time we search for his identity, decode his ciphers, or debate his motives, we're feeding something that was designed to consume our fascination and grow stronger with each passing decade? The fog still rolls across San Francisco Bay every evening, carrying with it the whispers of 5 confirmed victims and the shadows of countless others whose deaths may never be connected to the hooded figure who turned murder into performance art. David Faraday, Betty Lou Jensen, Darlene Ferrin, Cecilia Shepard, Paul Stein. Their names echo through 50 years of investigation, but their killer remains as elusive as the morning mist that shrouds the hills where he once hunted. The Zodiac Killer didn't just terrorize Northern California. He rewrote the rules of what a serial killer could be. He proved that with the right combination of intelligence, theatricality, and psychological manipulation, a predator could transcend his crimes and become something far more dangerous, a mythology that outlives its creator. His coded letters weren't just communications. They were invitations to participate in a game where the only winner was the one who designed the rules. And perhaps that's the most unsettling realization of all. In our desperate search for answers, in our obsession with solving his puzzles, in our endless fascination with his methods, we've become exactly what the Zodiac wanted us to become. We've become his audience, his collaborators, his unwitting participants in an experiment that may still be running after 5 decades. The case remains open, not because law enforcement has failed, but because some mysteries are designed never to be solved. Some predators understand that immortality doesn't come from avoiding capture. It comes from ensuring that the hunt never truly ends. Somewhere tonight, in the fog-shrouded hills of Northern California, the Zodiac's greatest achievement continues to claim new victims. Not through violence, but through our inability to stop searching for shadows that may have been designed to lead us nowhere at all. The question isn't whether we'll ever catch the Zodiac Killer. The question is whether we're brave enough to stop chasing him.